I should say, my proposal was for a balanced budget increase, and I think that it wouldn't have increased the national debt. I agree that it's a source of problems. But, I don't know that it solves everything. There are problems increasing infrastructure investment. I think we've been a little bit glib about that. And if you look at the CBO report about this failed American Jobs Act, they don't have any optimism that the infrastructure investment will be very big in the short run. It's hard to ramp these things up. And so it's not going to solve the 9.1% unemployment problem, but it's a step in that direction. And I think that maybe I agree with the real thing is to think about long-term growth, and that means developing our financial institutions and moving forward on a number of different fronts.
I can just briefly say something about infrastructure. So while I sympathize actually quite a lot with the need to improve the infrastructure in this country, I mean, we all know the difference between the train system in the US and in Europe, but I mean, do we really know the impact of infrastructure on growth? I guess the only serious piece of work on this I know is from Raj in India from the late 19th century. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty about the impact of the increase in infrastructure. And the second thing is actually I'm going to emphasize is that unfortunately the decisions on infrastructure which needs to be built is done by the government. And are we building infrastructure for yesterday's economy, the trains, the roads, or are we building infrastructure for tomorrow's economy? Who knows what's going to be there in 10 years? Maybe we need to build the spectrum and the new telecommunication things. And between the uncertainty about the impact of the estimates of the impact of infrastructure on long-term growth and the general, I think, inability of the government to pick winners, I don't think that infrastructure is a silver bullet that's going to help the US economy. In general, I think there is no silver bullet. And I think I agree with Bob on two things. I agree that improving financial markets is essential and important, and one has to remember that not to overregulate. Now the tendency of the regulatory pendulum, to me, seems to go way on the side of overregulation. And the long-term problems, I think, are essential.
Bill.
I want to address a little bit the issue of long run versus short run. And I think Aleh's points, I think, are worth really emphasizing. That I'd put them in a slightly different way. It's that when we think of designing programs to alleviate our short-run difficulties and to get back to full employment, we need to make sure that we have ones that don't stunt long-term growth. And I think that, so I think in a way Europe is a good object lesson to keep in mind, that we don't do things that are the worst of Europe. For example, work-sharing kinds of arrangements are the kinds of programs. So we might say we'll have a mandatory reduction in hours worked because there's a kind of lump of labor and let's share it out among the existing workers. That's been a program in Europe. I think it probably has been a failed one. Those, I think we have to be very careful in introducing our short-run programs that we don't do those kinds of programs that will stunt long-term growth. At the same time, I would like to emphasize that some of the things that are happening in the short run are very damaging to the long run. Investment is low, so we're going to end up at the end of this cycle with a lower capital stock than we would have. We'll end up with less investment in research and development. And probably worst of all is that the atrophying of job skills from people who've been out of the labor market for long periods of time, who've not been able to upgrade their skills and had the experience, on-the-job experience. So I think we have the prospect of having, I won't say a generation, but a whole group of workers who basically haven't gone through the period of developing their job skills. So at the end of this, I think our human and capital is going to be substantially less than it would be. And I think one of the reasons to get back to full employment is to actually have more capital and better skilled and more experienced workers. So part of it ought to be to get back in a way that gets us back to the more capital and more experienced workers without shortcoming that goal.
Any other comments? Bob, you? No.
Yeah, I was going to say something about the government as running, first of all, infrastructure. We're talking about public goods, so it has to be a public decision. The American Jobs Act, which was just blocked in Congress, would have created a corporation called the American Infrastructure Financing Authority that would consult with private sector people about making plans for infrastructure. Martin Shubik's proposal is for what he calls a Federal Employment Reserve Authority. And it sounds like the AIFA that was produced, but it has a clearer focus on the long term. What Shubik wants is to have a government agency that is continually in place to think about long-term projects that will be available and suitable for implementation should there be a downturn. It's interesting that Shubik didn't know this when he proposed it, but actually under the Roosevelt administration, they briefly tried something called the Public Works Reserve, which was a research group that was supposed to plan almost exactly what Shubik proposed. But it didn't work effectively because it was created in uncertain times in World War II. But I think that's the kind of thing that we have to get going. We have to start thinking about infrastructure in the long run and get into a position. And it doesn't have to be the government. So I had the opportunity to serve on the NSF panel once for economics, and I saw how the government can work. The National Science Foundation is a wonderful example of how the government can bring in outside thinkers. And we had a panel of experts that, in fact, Tom Sargent, the new Nobel Prize winner, was on our panel when I was on. We had good people. I think the government can do a good job in, if it's not the government, it's the people of this country that are doing the job.
Let me just add something about the timing of job creation. I think the Shubik idea is a good one, having a plan that you could speed up if there were a downturn. I think that makes a lot of sense. You might even go a little further in thinking about this. This is a fairly radical idea, but it's worth thinking about. The Federal Reserve is independent of Congress. It basically can make actions to change monetary policy through its own governance processes. 95% of the time, that's adequate for managing the economy. You don't have to have big swings in fiscal policy, only monetary policy, and that's a sufficient tool to sort of, prevent overheating of the economy. Frankly, had interest rates been taken up or collateral rates taken up by the Federal Reserve in the 4 or 5 years prior to the collapse, we would not have the problem we have now. So monetary policy typically works. In a deep recession, though, as a couple of panelists were saying, I think, monetary policy doesn't work. Interest rates are zero. Further cuts to the interest rate, unless you could create inflationary expectations, are not possible, and are not going to actually shift the mix and stimulate spending and get the economy restarted. So the question is, how do we? You have to use fiscal policy as a matter of logic and empirical evidence, and it's very hard for the Congress to mobilize on a short-term basis, as we've seen. I mean, we did not get very effective action out of Congress. The early package was something politically palatable, a payroll tax cut, which had very little impact because people were over-leveraged, and so they paid down their credit card debt with the extra percentage point or two that they got in their paycheck, and they didn't spend. So what's the solution? Well, maybe some kind of standby commission that can make a certain limited range of fiscal policy decisions when some trigger is hit, such as unemployment rate spikes by 3 percentage points or something like that. It's a kind of a, maybe not constitutional, it could be done by legislation, but it's an idea worth thinking about to get us out of the next possible recession.
Can I say one word about that? So one thing that happened in the crisis, which I think should also be made permanent, is the Fed realized that banks weren't lending and all kinds of markets were collapsing, like the credit card market, the student loan market. Those were all on the verge of disappearing entirely. And so the Fed went around the banks and lent on the securitizations. So they realize that when you're in a crisis and people are asking for it's not that the private sector wanted too high an interest rate, they wanted too much collateral. And so the Fed went around them and loaned with less collateral than the private sector was demanding. So I think that we should have a permanent facility to step in case there's a disaster like that again. It's analogous to the idea of a standby facility to get ready to do some infrastructure projects if all of a sudden you have a lot of available people. I want to say one more thing about the Fed. The Fed, so the Fed has done a quite good job. The crisis could have been much worse, but it's not that adventurous, the Fed, for all the talk of how adventurous it is. I mean, it missed the crisis. The same guys running the Fed now just had no clue what was going on before the crisis. And then they could be much more radical. We haven't reached the end of the line. We're determined not to have any inflation because that, somehow we can't, if inflation must be a disaster, the business community would go crazy or something. But if we set a price target that, in the next few years, we're going to try and see prices rise by 20%. So we don't want a permanent inflation. We want prices to go up in the near term for a while. That's a kind of policy they've never even considered. In fact, you can hardly raise it at the Fed. If you go to Jackson Hole or something, you barely mention it and they think you're crazy. But one of the ways of getting out of a hugely indebted economy, one of the standard ways of getting out of it is inflating away the debt. And you always have to worry that if you start an inflation, it'll spiral out of control. I think the most likely way we're going to get an inflation that spirals out of control is if the Fed repeats over and over again that there can't be an inflation. They have enough tools to prevent it. They're never going to let it go above 2%. And then it does go above 2% anyway. Then people will worry that it's out of control. So I think that would be, I'm not sure this idea actually is that good, but it's a radical idea that we haven't, haven't really considered seriously. So the fact is we have to do different things. We have to manage leverage. That's not something the Fed is willing to do. The ECB in Germany, I mean in Frankfurt, yes, but the head of the whole European Central Bank, Trichet, I said, what about managing leverage? And he said, well, it's very important, but we'll manage the interest rate and maybe somebody else can manage leverage. And I said, that's like the old Russian, the old Russians where they had one bureau in charge of prices and another bureau in charge of quantities. So, you want to have the whole thing in one place. So I believe that this crisis is going to be a stimulus to a more radical rethinking of a lot of our policy tools. In the long run, may be very helpful to macroeconomists and to the economy.
So I guess I mean, the thing that I might disagree with here is our discussion seems so divorced from the current political discussion, right? We're in a political environment where the Fed is not being criticized for doing too little. The Fed is being criticized for doing too much. So the idea that we're going to create another Fed-like institution with independence, seems completely, why, I don't know, because, 6 people here, perfectly
almost
in agreement.
Nothing we've said is politically feasible today.
Absolutely nothing we've said is politically feasible. That's my point, yeah.
No, the Fed is being criticized for doing too much by a certain conservative element. I mean, the people on Occupy Wall Street don't think the Fed's doing too much, okay? So there are a lot of people who think that government should have done more to rescue the unemployed and to rescue the 99% that you talked about. And I agree that we should do more.
To really take your question more seriously, I mean, what is the point of having an economics department at a great university except to think about what would be the right things to do? It's not our job to make the politics happen. I mean, that's unfortunate that the politics are extremely hard here, extremely hard. But some people should be saying, what according to the accumulated body of evidence and thinking within economics would make sense, and I think that's the spirit of this conversation.
Yeah. So I agree with that. I mean, I think I'm just saying, I think it's worth thinking about the next step, which is, if this isn't if these kind of solutions are completely infeasible, why are they infeasible? Why is this not part, of a national conversation on these issues? And, maybe Occupy Wall Street is, a step towards that.
Could I say that the fiscal stimulus is not infeasible? You have a president who's proposed it. You have a majority of one house that is in favor of a variant of it, and you've got another house that's just putting up resistance. So
Okay,
As compared to some of the other ideas
Yeah.
that
No,
that
that's
we've
fair.
had, it's actually not.
But
It's
again-
it's both in the mainstream of what macroeconomists think is a good idea, and it's not completely infeasible. So I think we shouldn't write it off.
No, but we still got it, but we do have, in deference to the political environment, we do have a fiscal stimulus that, like the first one, is 2/3 tax cuts and 1/3 job creation, and is not enough.
Well, okay, so there are differences of opinion on taxes versus expenditures, and so I don't think everybody thinks that you can only have expenditure and infrastructure increases. There's actually a good body of opinion that says tax cuts are effective. They don't have the same bang for a buck as expenditures, but they are effective. I think where we really run into difficulty is this long-run fiscal outlook and the confusion that I think, unfortunately, the president was partly responsible for until Labor Day, where he basically bought into the deficit reduction movement, and only after Labor Day did he kind of change his mind and decide that really jobs and expansion were more important than short-run deficit reduction. So I think people are very confused about that now, because for most of this year, until Labor Day, the president basically bought into the rhetoric of that deficit expansion is more important than anything, or deficit reduction is more important than anything else. And it's only recently that we've had even any argument with that at the very highest levels.